Okay, so now we're going to do something that's going to make you feel like maybe this whole video series has been a bit of a setup. What we're going to do is replace our entire framework.php code. I'm going to jump back to the editor here. All of the code in here with a single class declaration, and that's it. So let's see it in action and then talk about it. I'm going to go back to the resource pack directory, and I'm going to open step 61, framework.php, switching to use Http Kernel. Check out this code. Super simple. Copy this, and we'll paste it over the code in our framework.php file and save it. Now let's jump back to our resource pack, and we're also going to need to update our front.php file. So I'm going to open up step 62. I'm going to copy the code and paste it over the code in our front.php file and save it. This even got shorter. If we go back to the browser and refresh a page, we'll see that everything is working. Now caching has been turned off and our subscribers have been removed. But other than that, it looks the same as it did before. So let's look at what happened. I'm going to go back to the resource pack and let's compare our framework.php file with our previous example, which would be step 59. I'm going to drag these over to our file comparison tool, and let's look at everything that we're removing. So because we're not using these different classes, we can remove the use keywords up here. And then here, let's take a look at our methods. So we no longer need a constructor when we're using Http Kernel. And that's really the big change here, is that instead of our framework existing as its own thing, we're instead using Http Kernel. Now we removed our constructor, we removed our handler. And if we look at Http Kernel, that might be good at this point. I'm going to jump back to our examples folder, and I'm going to do a quick search for Http Kernel. And I'm going to scroll until I find it here. Okay, we have httpkernel.php. And we look at our constructor here. The constructor now takes a dispatcher and a resolver. And those are the only two things it needs. If we looked at our previous framework code, I'm going to go back to our comparison. Before we had a dispatcher, matcher, and a resolver. So something different is happening with our matcher at this point, since it's not being passed to the constructor. But that's something that you can try to figure out on your own at this point. If we scroll down, you see there's a handle, just like we had before, and this request type and catch all look really familiar from our previous handle request when we added support for caching. And those were the two methods in our framework. If we go back to our comparison between the old framework and our new one, we did some things inside of handle manually, including setting up our attributes and our controller and our arguments and passing all of these into our controller ultimately. We respond to 404s and other errors, and the same thing is happening inside of Http Kernel, just in different parts of the code. So awesome, our code has now gotten much more efficient, and really what we've been doing all the way up until this point, to some degree, is building up to understanding the value of using Http Kernel. We've been able to isolate code out of our framework until it's generalized and has a very specific purpose. And now we can see that that purpose is being fulfilled by Http Kernel. Let's take a look at our front controller and see what changed there. So I'm going to close this search here, and I'll go back to our resource pack, and I'm going to compare step 62, which is what we're working with now, to step 58, where we added caching. Drag these over to my file comparison tool. So it looks like 2 lines have been modified, and then we have a couple of lines that have been removed. In our current version, we're not supporting caching, so that's why these have been removed. Okay, so we're not using a couple of namespaces anymore. We no longer have to do the from request in our context. That's being done by our framework now. And then we've removed the subscribers for our content length listener and our Google listener. Instead, what we're doing is adding a subscriber for our router listener.